We should say that the book you've mentioned, which I've gotten a chance to read, and I think it's incredible, highly recommend. It's called Abundance. I think of it as a kind of manifesto for what the left would represent in the coming years. So I think people should read it uh, from that angle. And both of you have been writing about this topic sort of from different angles for a while. I think in 22, Derek, you wrote an article on this topic of abundance titled "A Simple Plan to Solve All of America's Problems." And Ezra, you wrote an article in 21 on supply side progressivism titled "The Economic Mistake the Left is Finally Confronting." And you've just laid out this more progressive perspective on supply side economics that you're presenting in abundance. I was wondering if you could kind of give the broad, high level explanation of this idea of supply side progressivism.
Well, my piece about the abundance agenda, which I wrote in 2022, started with me standing outside waiting for a COVID test. And this was a period where 2 years after the pandemic started, COVID tests were still being rationed. And it was like 21 degrees outside, and I was getting very, very frustrated about the fact that still we seem to have a scarcity of COVID tests. And as I'm sitting outside, just freezing my ass off and just getting really mad, I'm thinking, it's not just COVID tests we've had scarcity. We also had a scarcity of COVID vaccines early on in the rollout, which created this really discombobulated scheme for distributing the early COVID vaccines. And then also you go earlier into March and May of 2020, and we had a shortage of PPE equipment for our doctors to remain safe as they were taking care of a pandemic. And I thought, it's interesting that this entire experience of the pandemic has essentially been defined by this concept of scarcity. And as I zoomed out a little bit, I thought, it's not just the pandemic. It's really so much the 21st century economy that's been defined by scarcity. Ezra beautifully described the degree to which housing unaffordability has become the economic problem of our time. In the history of political orders, each political order is in part defined by the internal crisis. The Great Depression springs New Deal liberalism. Stagflation springs neoliberalism. Now we're in this molten moment where we're waiting for the new political order to emerge. And it's going to emerge because of the lever, because of the power of housing affordability. You have to solve that problem if you want to solve the problem of American anger about prices. And part of this is just pure arithmetic. If you look at any family's budget, the biggest part of their budget in any given year is the part that goes to rent or mortgage. It's housing, housing, housing. And housing connects to everything else. It connects to innovation. You want cities to agglomerate, to bring smart people together. Housing relates to all sorts of other affordability. Like if you care about the cost of childcare or elder care, you want to make it cheaper to house institutions, buildings that can care for children, which means you want to bring those rents down. And so I thought, as I'm zooming out on this concept of scarcity in the 21st century, we have chosen to make housing scarce. In some of the most productive cities and states, often run by Democrats, we have rules, zoning rules, historic preservation rules, permitting processes, environmental reviews, laws that we created that have gotten in the way of making abundant the most important material good there is, which is housing. And as I kept sort of working myself into a lather and getting mad about the world, I thought, it's actually not just housing, it's clean energy too. There's lots of environmentalists who are on my side and believing very fervently in climate change who've made it very difficult to site solar panels or site solar farms or to raise wind turbines or to advance geothermal or to accept nuclear power. We have chosen to make clean energy scarce as well. And then finally, the ultimate boss of scarcity was the pandemic itself, which constricted the supply of all sorts of goods around the world, setting the price of everything to the moon. And that's why inflation wasn't just an American phenomenon, not just a North American phenomenon, it was a global phenomenon. And I thought what we need to solve for this crisis of penumbral scarcity is an abundance agenda, an approach towards solving America's problems that puts abundance first. And Ezra and I have a very focused definition of abundance. We say in the first page of the book, America needs to build and invent more of the things it needs. We believe that housing is critical. We believe energy is critical. We talk a lot about science and technology. But we really put government effectiveness at the heart of this, because one really deep vein of our book is a criticism of where liberalism has gone wrong in the last 50 years, where liberalism has gone from, in the New Deal era, a politics of building things. I mean, FDR and the progressives transformed the physical world, not just with infrastructure projects, but with building roads, the highway system under Dwight Eisenhower. We changed the physical world during the decades of the 1930s to the 1950s. But in the last half century, liberalism has become very good at the politics of blocking rather than the politics of building. And if you look at the way that liberals define success in the last few decades, it's often about success defined by how much money you can spend rather than how many things you can actually build. I mean, you look at the fact that, for example, in the book, we have so many examples. California authorizes more than $30 billion to build a high-speed rail system, which basically doesn't exist. I mean, just last week, the mayor of Chicago bragged that they spent $11 billion building 10,000 affordable housing units. That's $1.1 million per affordable housing unit. That's absolutely pathetic. We have a story in the book about a $1.7 million public toilet built in San Francisco. $1.7 million for a toilet because of all of the rules that get in the way and raise the price of building public infrastructure like public bathrooms in San Francisco and California. So liberalism, I'm worried, over the last 50 years has become so good at the politics of blocking and the politics of associating the money authorized as success rather than what you build in the physical world, that we've lost sense of material abundance, of how important outcomes are and not just processes. And so this is a book that's trying to nudge the Democratic Party back to what we think are, in a way, historically its roots, thinking about what Americans need and making it easier for government to act efficiently to provide them. And that really does, I think, begin with housing and energy.
Is there a tension between kind of the left, the progressive wealth redistribution kind of ideas with the idea of building that's primarily sort of getting out of the way and letting the market get the job done?
Let's say two things on that. So one, we think there's a real tension between equality, redistribution, and constricting the supply of specifically housing.
So housing, by the way, I would love to understand this. That's the big problem of our era.
Housing and energy, I think, are the two most significant that we focus on in the book, right? Housing and clean energy. We don't have enough housing. We don't have enough clean energy. I would add things to that. Public infrastructure. We don't really focus that much on education, but we could, and we could talk about that. Immigration is probably there for me too, and we talk about that a little bit in the book. And we do talk a lot about how to pull innovation forward from the future. But when you ask about sort of redistribution, I really think this is an important point because there's a great new paper by David Schleicher, and I'm so sorry because I'm forgetting his co-author. They're law professors, though, and they talk about the victory of gentry law. We used to have a law that was very dynamic when it came to property and land. It was very different than how things were in Britain. And over time, sort of back half of the 20th century, we moved American law to be much more for what they call the gentry. We moved it much more towards protecting those who currently have things, right? And we do that through a million things, covenants and HOAs and all these sort of contracts we make people enter into so they can't even build on their own land. But one of the things that just happens when you constrict the supply of housing is that people who got in when the getting was good, it's a classic story in New York and LA and in SF. You bought a place in 1977 for $220,000 and now it's worth $2.7 million and maybe you'll pass it on to your kids or you'll sell it. But the working class families can't afford to live there anymore, right? So that's not even a question of redistribution. Sometimes what you need in order to create the possibilities for opportunity and mobility is enough supply of the thing. At the same time, we don't think like that redistribution is the problem here. I'm pro-redistribution. I'm pro more redistribution than we currently do. But to give one example, the way these can be great tastes that go together, Derek tells in the book at some great length the story of Operation Warp Speed. And here you have in the mRNA vaccines, technology that was critically funded by public money, specifically DARPA at different points. Then hastened, after COVID, government through Operation Warp Speed under Donald Trump, really tried to clear out regulatory cruft, move these things really fast. But the demand on the side of the public for having funded so much of this, for having made so much possible, was that when these vaccines hit, they were going to be free. Maybe the most important medical advance of that entire era. And it wasn't going to be like Ozempic, say, where it's, $15,000 for a year of doses, right? It wasn't going to be only available to the richest people at the beginning. We were going to try to give it to everybody, sorted by need to the best that we could, and it would be free. Now, you're not going to do that with everything, right? There are places for the price signal to actually function, and where it can function to then bring on more supply later. And, there's all the Econ 101 stuff that we all know. But there are a lot of places where redistribution and supply increases go hand in hand. Another good example, I've done over the course of my career a huge amount of work on health insurance reform and universal health care. And let's say you got, Bernie Sanders had become president in 2016 and had swept in a huge Democratic majority, and they passed Bernie's single payer for all plan, which was, by the way, much more expansive than any existing single payer plan in the world, right? It covered much more than Canada's or the UK's or anybody else. If you had done that, what you would have needed immediately was a huge supply increase in healthcare, because you would have had a huge demand increase. What happens if you make healthcare free? People are going to use more of it. If you make insurance much more widespread, people are going to go to the doctor more often. Well, if you don't have enough doctors, you don't have enough nurses, you don't have enough surgeons, you need more. We constrict the supply of all those things using residency rules, using nursing rules, immigration rules, who can practice as a nurse practitioner, what can a nurse practitioner actually do. You have to be attentive to the supply side, even if what you're doing is aggressive redistribution. Now, there are places where these things don't conflict. Like, I'd like to see a much expanded child tax credit, and I don't think that has a big supply side implication one way or the other. But on a lot of the things we're talking about, even if what you want to do, and it is often what we want to do more redistribution, if you're redistributing some kind of thing that gives you access to a good or a service, you need to expand the good or the service. We do rental vouchers. Giving people rental vouchers in the San Francisco housing market, unless you build more housing, just creates something that our friends at the Niskanen Center call cost disease socialism, where you are increasing demand for good at which you've constricted supply. If you do that, you're just going to drive the price up. To some degree, that's at least part of the story of higher education. We give people Pell Grants, we give people all kinds of subsidies for higher ed, but we have not done nearly enough to increase supply or regulate the way in which colleges just then pocket part of that money. And so they're building these fancy gyms and they're competing with each other, but they're not actually increasing the supply of slots. It's just certainly not the level we want them to. So there's a lot here where I think it scrambles traditional categories. You cannot do effective redistribution in ways that we would like to see them done, and many people on the left would like to see them done, if you're not taking supply of the thing that you're subsidizing seriously.
If you think about it from a first principle standpoint, what if what you wanted to do was to bring American poverty as close to 0.0% as you possibly could? You got a bunch of smart people into a room. You said, what can we possibly do? In my opinion, the answer would include a lot of what are sometimes called demand side policies, a lot of redistribution of income. The child tax credit, I think, would be essential. Expanding the earned income tax credit would be essential. Expanding cash welfare might be essential. Certainly redistributing income from the rich to the poor would be essential. These are demand side policies. They're tax and spending policies. But if you only approach this subject through the demand side, you will utterly and categorically fail. Because like we said, housing is the biggest part of a typical family's budget. And if your only policy on housing is to increase housing vouchers without increasing the supply of housing, macroeconomically speaking, there's only one direction for housing prices to go, and it's straight up to the moon. You're not actually bringing housing prices down. You're just subsidizing a constricted market and therefore creating enormous inflation. You have to solve some of these problems on the supply side. And one of the conceptual scoops that Ezra and I are trying to work out for the left, for liberals in America, is to get people to ask the question, how do we solve this problem with supply? Housing is a crisis. How do we solve it with supply? Energy is a crisis. How do we solve it with supply? Medical innovation, scientific discovery is a massively interesting phenomenon. We don't even understand how it exists, really. Like, how do great discoveries actually happen? Is there a supply side policy for that as well? That's the question we're asking over and over in the book. So at the end of the day, demand side progressivism and what Ezra calls supply side progressivism really are peanut butter and chocolate. They are two flavors that go beautifully well together. But here's the problem that I think your question was putting your finger on. I think a lot of Americans don't believe that these things work together because what they see is a liberalism that just taxes and spends, and Americans don't see the benefits of that spending. The Biden administration authorized $42 billion to build rural broadband in America. Practically none of it was built. Authorized $7.5 billion to build EV charger stations in America. Practically none of it was built. How many tens of billions of dollars have been authorized to build high-speed rail in California? Practically none of it exists. You can't ride it. So the problem is when the reputation of a tax and spend liberal makes contact with the fact that people don't see the results in the physical world. Like, where's my money going? I have in my head something like this idea of what I call Equinox liberalism, which is to say there's some forms of liberalism where it's very expensive, but you see what you're getting. Like when you spend $270 to go to Equinox for the month, right? It's a really expensive gym bill, but people who go there seem to love it. They're like, the equipment is always free. Everything is clean. I go into the locker room. There's a bunch of Kiehl's lotions to like put on my face after I shower. I am getting exactly what I'm paying for. Yes, I'll pay out the nose for a gym because I love seeing that money going to work. And in places like Sweden, Denmark, citizens seem very happy. They're paying much higher taxes than people are in America, but they're seeing where the money's going to work. The problem with a liberalism that blocks rather than builds is that people don't see the money going to work. All they see are the dollar signs being spent by government, and then they walk out of their house and they see collapsing infrastructure, and they see crime, and they see housing prices going to the moon. And so they think, wait, this social contract is broken down. You're asking for Equinox prices, but you're giving me a shit-ass gym. And that's unfair. And so what we're trying to say is, I mean, in a very serious way, because I'm not trying to be flippant about gyms. In a very serious way, what we're trying to say is a part of this problem is that you Democrats have looked so hard at the demand side of the ledger that you've forgotten how powerful the levers are on the supply side. And if we can just pull those levers on housing in particular, we can bring down the cost of living, and people might even support the tax and spend model more because they'll feel like they're participating in Equinox liberalism and not its opposite.